I've often referred to our guest Steve Krah as the Biblioteca de Baseball, or the Dictionary of the Diamond here in Indiana, because he is really above anybody else in documenting baseball in our great state. The Northridge High School graduate up in northern Indiana has served as a professional journalist for over 30 years. He's worked for many daily newspapers as a sports correspondent throughout northern Indiana, including Warsaw, South Bend, Goshen, Elkhart. As a freelancer, he's contributed to the Indiana Football Digest, the South Bend Cubs, the Associated Press for Notre Dame football and basketball. He's contributed directly or by reference to numerous projects documenting baseball in Indiana, including the Limestone League, spring training in Indiana during World War II, and Indiana-born Major League Baseball players, a biographical dictionary, 1871 to 2014. He was the lead writer and researcher for two books that I'm proud to say I have: Slicer Baseball, A Cut Above, The History of LaPorte High School Baseball, and self-published Hitting and Hurling in the Heartland, A Look at Indiana High School Baseball. He has won many state and national awards for coverage of baseball and wrestling and has covered over 50 different sports in his career. I didn't even know there were that many. He's a longtime member and contributor for the Society for American Baseball Research, and in 2017, he launched his own baseball blog, IndianaRBI.com, which he has interviewed everybody from big-time big leaguers to wannabe hat collectors. We go from the pro with the pen to the master of multimedia. Chances are, if you've tuned in to any high school state championship in Indiana over the last 20 years on TV, radio, or streaming online, then you've seen Greg Rakestraw on the job. A valedictorian, I even had to Google how to spell that, of his class at Lanesville in high school, his chemistry teacher once told him, "I can't believe you want to waste that mind and your talents being a play-by-play sports announcer." But as Rick Vanderwielen put it on his article on Greg on IHSATV.org, we're the beneficiary of Rake's decision. I couldn't agree more. Greg calls the championships for volleyball, soccer, football, basketball, softball, and baseball on Fox Sports Midwest and IHSATV.org. He's been part of the airwaves across Indiana going back to his days as a Greyhound at the College of University of Indianapolis in the late 90s. In his career, he's made stops at WPZZ, ESPN 950, Hometown Sports Indiana, 1070 The Fan, and now serves as the vice president of the Champ Sports Network here in Indiana. Among the many current projects he is linked to, he hosts Soccer Saturday each week, assists in the coverage of month of May from the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, is the voice for the Indy 11 and IUPUI basketball, and the post-game show host on the Colts Radio Network. Me? Well, I'm a hat collector. Welcome to another episode of Baseball Across Indiana, where we are talking about the other careers in baseball, other careers in sports generally. In this series, we are looking at the non-coaching and non-player careers in the industry of baseball. And today we're talking media careers. I am merely Hardy the Hat Guy, and of myself and my two guests, Steve Krah and Greg Rakestraw, I am the least qualified to be conducting an interview. But that's what I'm going to do because I am a fan of baseball and equally a fan of what these guys do. And I mean that sincerely, guys. Steve, Greg, I appreciate you joining me today. I think this is going to be a lot of fun because we're looking at it from a career standpoint. You know, I want to go back to what made you decide to go where you are today, how you got there. You know, let's talk about, for the young Hardy the Hat guys out there still in high school that want to have a career in sports media at any level. Let's talk about that as well. We have a unique perspective here too, because, we look Steve Krah, I said he's the pro with the pen, and that's for certain true. A lot of his background is really in written media for newspapers and blogs and books and things like that. And then Greg Rakestraw, you've seen him all over, like I said, the TV, the radio, streaming online. So we got a really neat perspective here, guys. I'll tell you what, as we start this out, there's a lot of things we could talk about, and I'm going to try to keep this under 6 hours. But let's talk first about just the cool parts of the job. The moments where you say, man, I love my job. I made the right career choice. I know it's work. We got to make a living. Sometimes you just got to roll up the sleeves. But other times you're like, man, I'm glad I'm doing what I'm doing. Let's start here in Indianapolis. Greg, what do you think? Where's those times? Maybe it's just something general, or maybe a specific moment where you said, man, I'm a kid right now. I'm just living the dream.
Well, I'll keep it from a baseball perspective. And so, the pinnacle of doing baseball in this state at a high school level is to do a game at Victory Field that's for a state championship. And I have had the unique nature of being able to call not one, but two games involving, one of the hats right off your right shoulder, seeing my hometown team, playing a state championship game, losing 2016 to Daleville and winning against Rossville in 2017. And so the ability to, broadcast that game, and I played in the days just before class sports. And so the line that I keep going back to when I think about Lanesville playing in state championship is kind of like Norman Dale at the end of Hoosiers when he's talking to the reporters in the gym about playing at Hinkle, and he goes, it's kind of like you and me going to the moon. It's the same feeling I have because in high school, our dream, having competing against New Albany and Floyd Central in every sectional was just trying to dream about winning a sectional. It was never about playing for a state championship. And for me to have a job where I get to play a part of the soundtrack of that experience for folks, that's the part I get goosebumps just thinking about it now. When it comes, though, to having now done baseball state finals over the course, my first set of ones is 2007, and not every year, but most years since that time, having called some of those games, there's a moment, and it's amazing when you think about Victory Field in general, when you sit back from our location, the press box or the broadcast booth, and you're not looking down at the action, and you see me kind of looking up, visualizing this in my mind, and you see the skyline of Indianapolis reflected between the left field foul pole and the right field foul pole. And I get to go, you're being paid to be here and enjoy this view and paint this picture and supply information for baseball fans across the state. And now, because of technology, for baseball fans around the world. And again, I get paid to be there for it. Life's pretty good when that's the case.
Well, I'll tell you what, you just painted a good picture there, and it makes me think about it like we talked about offline before we get started here. I get the ability to be able to edit this video and probably edit over a bunch of the misspoken words and things I'm probably going to do. You're doing it live, and that's a perspective that's called talent right there. So it's a beautifully painted picture right there. Steve, let's go up to you. You've been all over the state, as both of you have, and you've interviewed a ton of great people. And hat collectors to boot. So tell us about some of those times when you're interviewing people and, you've just lost track of what he said because you're just kind of lost in the moment, or, there are parts where you're saying, man, I got to put this down, but you're loving it. You're in the moment. Tell us about some of those, either those interviews or your travels, some of the projects you've worked on where you said, man, I'm in the right place.
Oh, thanks for having me, Dan. I've been all over the place. When I was working on my book 20 years ago, with, encouragement from some of the coaches that were really instrumental, people like Bill Jones, who was at DeKalb and was an executive director for the Indiana High School Baseball Coaches Association for so many years. Dick Seiler, who was the coach at Elkhart Memorial at the time, and he, was in his 7th decade of coaching this year. People like that said, we ought to have a book. So I took off and I went all over Indiana, and I get to think I go back and think sometimes I was on so-and-so's couch, or I was in so-and-so's living room talking baseball with them. I can remember when I walked out of the car and I could hear the Ohio River rushing by in Rockport and things like that. Greg was talking about the state finals, and my thing has always been that everybody has a story. You just got to see what it is. And it isn't necessarily the guy that's in the 3-hole hitting 350 with 10 home runs. I remember covering a few years ago when Northview won a 4A's title. And it's like, I'm way removed, 30 years removed from being in Brazil, Indiana, my first job out of college. But I'm saying, how are you related to so-and-so? And it turns out that, they were related to some of the people that I remembered back in the day. but the kid that gets the winning hit was hitting less than 200 and way down at the bottom of the batting order. And I thought, that's a really neat story. And so, and it doesn't have to be a state championship, but it could be a conference championship. It could be the sectional. It could be, somebody just had the best day of their life, and you get to talk to them about it. That's been fun.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, as I'm listening to both of you tell these stories, one thing I'm thinking about is, I'm here just a fan, and I've got all this technology and all this stuff that I've documented to help me reference all this stuff. You guys are just a library in your mind, and all the experiences you've picked up over the years. And I like the way you put it, Steve, and just watching Greg over the years as well. One thing I can say about both of you is you're right. You give equal credit and equal exposure to the guy hitting 200 in the 8-hole compared to the standout athletes, and not just the individuals, but sports as well. I love the fact that you guys aren't just, I'm a football fan, I'm a basketball fan too, but you're not just covering those things. You're covering some of the, without sounding, making them sound less, because to me they're not, but some of the sports that traditionally don't get the large crowds. And you give equal passion to all of them, which is why I love having both you guys on here. Steve, you mentioned a few names. Let's do some name dropping here. You've talked to, both of you guys have, been involved with or associated with, either from an interview standpoint or broadcasting, with some big names over the years. So as you think back, who are some of the big names that you guys have got to work with over the years that you're like, wow, I'm glad to get that notch on the resume right there to get to talk to him. So Steve, let's go back to you. You've interviewed about everybody in baseball. Who are some of the big names that, as you look back, and I know there's a ton, you don't have to give apologies for skipping anyone, because you guys have both talked to a million, but just off the top of your head, who are some of the people you've talked to in the past, some of the big names that you're like, wow, that was a good catch to be able to get that interview?
Well, I think of Ken Schreiber. I mean, he was he coached for 39 years at LaPorte High School. And I knew so much about him being from Northern Indiana, or just paying attention to baseball. And when I was writing something back in the 80s, when I was at Brazil, I remember picking up the phone, and he had all the time in the world for me. Little did I know that, flash forward 30 years, I would be working on a baseball about LaPorte book about LaPorte baseball, and spending all that time with him. I feel very fortunate that I got to do that. Dave Pischker at Andrean just passed him on the wins list. So there's two guys with 1,000 victories, and I've talked to those guys many times. So those are just two people in the high school baseball world. So many other people. Well,
I'll tell you my Dave Pischker story real quick here on a sidetrack. I'm on this hat project where I'm trying to get official baseball hats from, every high school in the state. So I go up to Andrean when I'm touring the region up there, and I'm up to Andrean. It's before the game, and I try to get in and get out of the way. I try to be, I don't want to get in anybody's way. I'm just a hat collector. I don't make it out to be anything bigger than that. So I'm up to Andrean, and they're, Coach Pischker's out there doing this, pregame routine that it's a finely oiled machine, I'm telling you. And he stops and comes out to get me the Andrean hat. And like a fool, I say, Coach, what win are we going for here? Then he goes, well, and I just dropped my head because I knew it right away. It was win 1,000. I felt like I just jinxed him. But so I'm trying to get out of the way. I get the picture with him real quick. And of course, I didn't change the hat. I still have my Montreal Expos hat on. So when you see that picture online, it's because I photoshopped the Andrean hat on. So that's my Dave Pischker story right there. So I love that you're talking about, Ken Schreiber. I mean, this is a legend in Indiana baseball for sure. Greg, you've talked to people from all sports across the board. What are some of the big names that you were proud to finally get that interview with, or the moments like that?
It's funny, and I'll give you two examples that are non-baseball here, but it kind of dates me and where I'm from an age standpoint as well. I got to be around Peyton Manning on a daily basis, during his time with the Indianapolis Colts, and so that's the name that most people, kind of say, hey, some of the big names you talk to, I go, well, Reggie Wayne and I are friends. We did a radio show together, for a couple of years. And Edgerrin James, Edgerrin knows me well because I interviewed him on a weekly basis, during his time with the Indianapolis Colts. The two guests that I was the most nervous about early in my career as a talk show host, one was Damon Bailey, just because Damon was a senior when I was in the 8th grade. And literally the last interview I did, I was telling a story, and I'll recount it here. Growing up in Southern Indiana, you would have your schedule, and then you would check the Bedford schedule. Say, okay, here are the nights that we're off and they're playing. And then it became, okay, where do we think we can find a ticket to go watch him play? Well, now through the years, I've gotten to kind of know him. And so there's no nervous. This is where it's kind of old friends catching up and talking about who we know, so to speak. But if you had told me as I was breaking into the business, hey, that guy that you watched with like 40 other thousand people at the RCA Dome, and you kind of get to know him and he knows who you are, I just start laughing and telling you're full of it, and that was the case. The other person that I felt that way the first time I talked to him was Danny Sullivan. And that is because Danny is from Louisville. And I grew up just on the other side of the river from Louisville. And so interviewing him like in 2002 in my talk show days on 950, and thinking about how many posters, pictures, etc. I had of the spin and win in '85, him winning the Indianapolis 500. So those are two that stand out in my mind. I'm like, I can't believe I am specifically talking to this person. But from a baseball perspective, there are all kind of major leaguers and former major leaguers I've had a chance to talk to. I think about guys that I called them in a high school baseball state final that are playing in the pros. For example, Jared Parker, while unfortunately injuries got in the way, didn't have exactly an extended major league career, he was the #1 draft pick of the Arizona Diamondbacks and then pitched in the 3A state championship game just a few days later for Norwell. Or Kevin Kiermaier, having played at Fort Wayne Bishop Luers, of course, now with the Tampa Bay Rays. The major leaguers, though, that I had a chance to work with in doing some stuff. So for 4 years, I was the voice of the American Legion World Series. And it's a great event. And even with as many different things as I get to do, and you were great to rattle those things off, you can't do everything, because Lord knows I've tried to broadcast everything over the years. So I no longer do that, but I was the voice of the American Legion World Series for 4 years. The first 2 years, my broadcast partner was Jeff Kent. The third year, my broadcast partner was Howard Johnson. I had a really good middle infield of Mets players put together in those years of doing that. I loved working with those guys, and to kind of see those guys after watching them, especially Hojo being a bit older, and watching him win a World Series in '84 with the Tigers and '86 with the Mets, and then getting to work them and meet them and go, these are just regular guys. I'd be really good at playing baseball. That's a pretty cool life experience right there.
And I'll tell you what, that I'm a big fan of American Legion baseball. I mean, you look at the state tournaments, and the American Legion scene's kind of dwindling a little bit, but you still look at that state tournament and the national tournaments and the regional tournaments. Those are all-star teams, and you talk about a high level of baseball. So you're doing one of them. I'm sure you've seen a lot of people that you can't even recall that are in the bigs right now. So let's back it up a little bit. We talked about some of the high school people that you talked to, Steve, and you did, Greg, and Greg, that the quote that was on the IHSA TV website there about what your chemistry teacher said, that was just fantastic. I love it. Let's go back to high school, or even before that. Let's go back to the day, and looking forward. You're a high school kid, or even younger. What led you, or when led you into the professions you're at now in media? Greg, we left off with you. Let's go back to you. Take us back to Lanesville or before. And when did Greg picture I want to be the voice of Indiana sports?
I would put it like that. But I knew from the age of 5 I wanted to be a sportscaster. And I fell in love with watching sports on TV. And the first sport that I got to watch on a regular basis, and the first sport that I got to play, was baseball. And so I'm sure I'm like most kids. I've got 20,000 baseball cards still at home in Lanesville. And literally just off camera, let's see. Here's an '89 Fleer box that I happen to have. I've got a couple of other sets somewhere here. Here's a little 90 Upper Deck action for you. And let's go 91 Fleer.
Yes.
So I started collecting baseball cards in like 82, 83, started playing about that time. But I just became infatuated with watching sports on TV. And so that's what I wanted to be for a living, was to be a sportscaster. The running joke that I tell people is that even at the age of 5 or 6, I had the innate knowledge I was not going to be a good enough athlete to be a professional ball player. Being a sportscaster was my way to be in sports for a living. So like when I would go to career fairs in high school, they were wastes of time for me. I was going to be a sportscaster. That was what I was going to do. But if I had had a plan B, if that wouldn't have worked out, I probably would have been a high school teacher and a high school coach and a coach of multiple sports, and baseball being one of them. So I just, at a very young age, I knew I was going to work in sports for a living. And I'm so lucky that I'm able to follow that dream for all of these years.
Well, and looking at your time in history, so to speak, of when you grew up was when ESPN was starting to get big. So I see your influence is that, ESPN now is like for, guys our age was the end all be all. I remember the day that we got cable TV. I'm like, I didn't know this was possible,
Right.
seeing those guys. And then now we go to Steve, you're a little bit older than us. Your perspective, I always said that I was born in the wrong era because I like the 50s and 60s and 70s that, you could get everything in the newspaper, and your background is, your career is in the penmanship. So take us back to your time when you were at Northridge High School or even before. When was that time where you either identified that I'm really good at this, or you know what, I want to stick with this? When did Steve Krah realize that he wants to become Steve Krah that we know today?
I think I'm going to trace that back to growing up in Mishawaka, Indiana, back in the 70s, and I'm in elementary school. And I had some really good teachers that allowed every book report, I get to write about sports. I remember reading a book about Bob Feller and writing that. And one year I was Bob Feller for Halloween because I was infatuated with him right there at that time. And then, you go to the middle school, and I'm at Virgil I. Grissom Middle School, which is on the south side of Mishawaka. It's in the Penn system. And they had the Grissom Grapevine. And that was my first newspaper experience. And we wrote stories that were about yay long. My buddies would say, hey, put my name on that, put my name on it. They'd get credit. So I'd write about a 5-inch story, and it'd have 3 bylines. So I was kind of hooked right then and there. And then my dad was in the RV business, so he got tired of making the commute back and forth from Mishawaka to Elkhart County. We moved over there, built a house, and that's how I ended up at Northridge. So I was at Northridge, which is in Middlebury, for my high school years. And during that time, I got to work for the Middlebury Independent, which is a weekly paper, and got my beak wetted there. And then they rebooted the high school paper, and so I was involved there. So right along the way, Leonard Beachy, he was the language arts teacher, or English, as they call it some places. And he put my name in to go to journalism workshop, and that was at Ball State. And I ended up being in the same session with Ron LeMaster Jr. And I found out, I didn't know this before, but Ron LeMaster Sr., who's a long-time sports editor at the Muncie Star, his dad, and sometime in my not letting go of everything, I'll come across this interview I did, and it was written in longhand. I didn't even have a way to type it. I don't even know if I could type at that time, but I got my interview that I did with him during that class. Flash forward to going to Ball State, and I strung for Ron LeMasters. And so that was kind of how I got started. So I decided kind of in elementary school, it got a little stronger in junior high, and then in high school, that's definitely what I wanted to do.
Well, I'll tell you what, it's a good segue there too, because the high school and younger, that's where the interest kind of builds. Then we get into college, and now we're starting to formulate it. Now we're starting to say, hey, if this is going to be a career, I need to figure out what I'm doing here. So, Steve, you talked about going to Ball State now, and you got into the journalism. So tell us about your college experience. You know, were you involved with, go into maybe some little more detail about, were you involved with any professional writing while you were in college? How did your college education, from your specific college education, lead you to your career today? And then maybe we could also talk about, was it specifically tailored for what you're doing today, or was it just you kind of led into that? So let's talk about your college, the education specifically. Think about, there may be the tens of people that are watching this. One of them's wanting to be into the media. What are you going to tell that kid based on your college experience?
Well, I said before, I went to Ball State. I graduated in August of 1986. I've told people, I said at the time, and I said it over the years, that I learned as much, from working at the Ball State Daily News. I started the spring of my sophomore year. Looking back, I wish I would have started right from the freshman, year, but I got involved in some other things, and I was in a service organization and kind of feeling my way. I was the student manager for the baseball team for just a little over a year, and I did different things, but started out doing that. And then by the end of, my college days, I was covering the team. But I said, I couldn't understand. I was in some of these classes with people, and I said, to get some practical experience, you should get involved, with the magazine or the newspaper or, whatever it is. Or if you're in telecommunications, then you ought to go work at the TV or the radio station or do something. I think you learn more. I learned stuff in my classes. I certainly did, but I think it's just, day in and day out doing it is where you really learn. And my sequence was sports information, but I was doing daily newspapers, so I decided that was the way I was going to go. I did an internship at Tri-State in Angola, which is now Trine.
Mm-hmm.
And I was, at the time, they had a relationship with Ball State, and they had a rotating sports information director was a student. So I did that during the fall semester. So I learned a lot about soccer because I lived in the dorm, and right next to the soccer coach across the hallway was my boss, who was like the media relations director. Her husband was the baseball coach. And so I learned all about that stuff. They started the Hall of Fame, Sports Hall of Fame there at Tri-State, and I was right in there on the ground floor of that. Travel with the teams, right up until the beginning of the basketball season. Then I went back to school. So I said the practical experience is important.
So if I'm summarizing that, you're a journalism major, correct? And
journalism major, history minor.
History minor, okay. So that makes perfect sense with everything you're doing. And then, but the big highlight for the high school really was getting that practical experience while you're in college, with internships and a lot of the connections that you've made, and just meeting people, et cetera. Is that
That's right. And along the way, I said, I mentioned Ron LeMaster Sr. I strung, during the basketball seasons, a couple of years there. And of course, I learned a lot doing that as well. I did one game in Muncie, as the low guy on the totem pole. You don't do games in Muncie. You go to the outreaches, outskirts. And so I can say I've been to a lot of places like, Randolph Southern and Mississinawa and on and on and on. One game I did was Muncie Burris, and they played their games. I think they still play them right there on the Ball State campus. But that was a big learning experience as well.
Well, and and I like the fact that, you're talking about the soccer and the other sports, getting well-rounded. And Greg, as we move to you, that's kind of a good segue there too, because I know, you did every sport in high school. I think I saw you played tennis at UIndy, but then you also, during your education time at Indy, you were involved with some sort of project there where you got some internship or really on-the-job training before you even graduated. Let's go into your college career there at UIndy.
Sure. I was looking to play tennis, and it came down to playing tennis or baseball at UIndy. And I was lucky enough, obviously, in Indiana high school, tennis is a fall sport. So you can play both. A lot of kids do play both tennis and baseball. I played basketball the first 2 years of high school and realized, hey, it's by far my third best sport. I legitimately think I've got a chance at the small college level to play tennis or baseball. Let me focus on those two. And I went in with the best recruitment you could possibly have when you walk onto a college campus and want to be a walk-on. I was lucky enough to have a full academic ride. I could go to both coaches and say, hi, I'd like to play. You never owe me a dime. Baseball, I had to try out. Tennis basically was said, hey, practice starts this date in August. And I went with tennis. And it was in large part just because I felt I had a better chance of keeping my academic scholarship because the travel schedule was not going to be as rigorous as it was in baseball. As Steve knows, and Dan probably know this too, that, you know, the schedule those guys keep in baseball in the spring semester is rough. The amount of time that, you know, basically playing Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, you know, for about a 3-month stretch of time. So I ended up picking tennis, but then I would still get back to covering baseball, you know, from a play-by-play standpoint. So I was lucky enough to go to a school where I could, even as a freshman, I had a chance to do some campus radio and do play-by-play in color for football and for basketball and some selected baseball games, while then being a student athlete and while playing tennis. But then also being in Indianapolis, it allowed you the chance to work part-time, you know, in the professional realm. And so I got my first professional gig in radio at WNDE, which is still an all sports station, was the first and only all sports station in town for many years. It's now going on 25, 30 years of being predominantly an all sports station. And so I legitimately got offered a full-time job a month before I graduated from college. And this was, it was in April of '98. And whether you wanted to be a writer or a broadcaster, or you talk about kind of the non-traditional baseball careers, which is the overview for this conversation. It's one of the joys of going to a UIndy or a Butler or a Marion, Ball State, IU, whatever. And if you want to work in sports, whether it's the broadcaster, sports marketing, sports administration, and most colleges have some degree track that goes along with that now. You've got so many opportunities to get on the job training, whether it's an internship, whether it's, you know, a paid part-time. You know, the Indianapolis Indians, of which you're wearing that sweet Circle City lid that they debuted last year, they're one of the few things in sports, and Steve knows this as well. It is rare that you get an internship where you actually get a paycheck. The Indianapolis Indians are one of the places that offer that. And you can learn so much about the business of sport by doing that. And so it's one of the things I was very lucky that I chose to go to school, not just the University of Indianapolis, but in Indianapolis. It was one of the great sports markets in this country. And that really was what hit the fast forward button on my career.
Well, I'll tell you, that's as we progress through your career, we kind of leave college. We talked about both of you had the opportunity to kind of hit the ground running, so to speak. I know, I'm sure it wasn't a great smooth process. It never is right out of college into your career, but you had something waiting for you because of that hands-on stuff that you were doing during college. So between that first job and now, and Steve, you mentioned a couple of them, but who are some of the maybe the opportunities or the people, you know, and both of you kind of hinted at this, but kind of getting at that need for connections to, you know, move yourself throughout your career. Who are some of those connections that you made and maybe not necessarily the exact people, or maybe so, but the types of people that you meet within the industry that helped, you know, move you along throughout your career or steer you in the right direction, if you will. You know, we all have maybe family members or things like that cheer us on, but who are some of the people in the industry that really help direct you into where you are today? Greg, maybe let's bring it back to you. You know, you're doing
Sure.
a lot of sports. You met a lot of people. Who are some of those that have helped direct you?
There were 3 college level people that were major influences on me. One of them is Joe Gentry. And so Joe, Steve mentioned he was a sports information major. Joe was the sports information director at UIndy at the time. He's now the associate AD at Butler. Joe was also my tennis coach at UIndy. And so literally poor Joe saw more of me than did his wife and kids my 4 years in college, because we would travel on the road together for football and basketball, and he would turn around and coach me during the course of the spring. And I guess I must not be too annoying because we're still friends to this day, some 22 years later. Ed Railing was the general manager at WICR and really got me going in the right direction in quick fashion because he realized I had the passion and talent. What I didn't have going to such a small school, we didn't have a campus radio station. I could write for the school newspaper. And I did in high school and I did it in college at UIndy as well, just because even though it wasn't going to be my career path, it was still great experience for me in something along the lines. Because trust me, there's stuff from my writing days that help me now, given what I do. And the other person that served as a great mentor for me, and he got on campus my senior year, was Scott Eaker. He took over for Ed as the general manager. And I've had other great mentors and connections and friends along the way. You mentioned Rick Vanderweilen, who was quoted in the IHSATV.org piece. He's the guy behind Hometown Sports Indiana. He's a big driving force behind the IHSA Champions Network now. And as far as professional mentors go, he's the guy that I have to mention. And so I will share with you this story. I'm lucky enough where the last couple of years I've had a chance to do the preseason games on television for the Indianapolis Colts. And obviously there are only 32 of those jobs that go around. And to be able to consider to have the talent to be able to do that, I'm honored by that. But I don't get to that point if I don't have Rick going over a lot of my broadcast very much with a fine-tooth comb. And when literally my next two conversations after we film this are with college students about projects they've done. And I will tell them what I've told others in a similar boat. If I'm being nitpicky, that means you're really good. So if I am really driving down to the details, that means you've got a great base to work with. And I don't get that opportunity with the Colts were it not for Rick really pointing out every little thing and how you can get better at every step along the way. So I have frankly had too many to count, but there are four that immediately come to mind off the top of my head.
I'll tell you what, and that's a good point as we move to you, Steve. Just one of the oldest sports adages is you don't worry about the coach that stays on you. You worry about the coach when they stop, because if they see something, they're going to stay on you. So that's a good point of we all need that person in our life. If we're focusing on getting to the career that you guys are enjoying right now, I think, the education piece we talked about, getting in early while you're in college, but then finding that mentor that's going to be real with you. And
Mm-hmm.
Steve, as we move to you, you've got connections all over the state that have helped you make the connections for the content that you produce. Let's talk about some of the connections like Greg talked about that were, maybe a mentor to get you where you are, and what did they do? And, from the perspective of, wow, this really helped me, college students watching this video, high school students, you need to find a person like this. Who was that person for you?
Well, we're communicating with all this technology here, but believe it or not, at one time there wasn't an internet. And I remember going every day. Sometimes I would walk, sometimes I would ride my bike from the Daily News over to the Sports Information Office. And every day I would see Mana Fall was a secretary, and John Ginner was the assistant SID, and there's Earl Yestingsmeyer. Yestingsmeyer, a legend. Earl Yestingsmeyer was also the golf coach. I think the golf building there at Ball State's named after him. Great guy. I can remember, going with him to Toledo and other places like that on Mac Media days. He was just, he would give little critiques of what you were doing, but he was very upbeat, positive guy. My first job was at the Brazil Times, a small daily near Terre Haute. Jim Dressler was the managing editor there. I'm grateful to him that he gave me my first opportunity. We worked hard there. I mean, we worked long hours, kind of learn on the job. The younger guys there, we kind of leaned on each other, but they gave us the freedom to do that. And then I worked at the Elkhart Truth, for 25 and a half years. And Denny Kraft was a sports editor when I got there. And he gave me opportunities. Then Rick Meyer became the sports editor. He was the assistant. And Rick's type A personality, you do things the right way. And he was very helpful. Bill Beck then became the sports editor, and I worked with him that whole time. He just helped in so many ways. Jeff Gillespie was one of the managing editors. Jim McNeil was a longtime newspaper guy. Learned a lot from him. And then along the way, I got to know people like Paul Condrey. And Paul Condrey's the president, founder of the Regional Radio Sports Network. He and I have become very good friends, but I've also worked with him, worked Indiana Football Digest, the LaPorte baseball book, the Penn football book. That's his company that put that together. I did a little bit on Penn. I did a lot on LaPorte, and I, sat on his radio shows. But he's just been a very, very strong, positive influence for me. So those are just a few people. Lots of mentors, but those people came to mind.
Well, the what I'm hearing is, making the connections, I don't know of any career where you're doing it from an island. However, as we kind of segue into two more things I want to talk about here as we get close to wrapping it up is, and, Steve, really in your side, and Greg, probably you too, is, as far as if we think of the question, what doesn't get done in your career if you don't do it? Meaning, we have people around us that collectively help us in what we're doing with our career. But Stephen, in writing, obviously, you're self-reliant on getting the content out there. So as we look at that, as we look at your career, as far as a author, a correspondent, all the different titles we can give you of the pen, of the written text in regards to sports in general or baseball. Tell me about the industry. How are you finding your content? How are you getting the stories? How are you doing what you do on a daily basis? Just give people the perspective, the person who's looking at careers in media from the written text perspective. Just give us that global view of the journalist, correspondent, author. What keeps the lights on for Steve Krah?
I refer to myself sometimes and to my friends that I've known a long time as the ink stain wretch. And a lot of people don't know what that is unless the product ends up on a piece of paper with ink on it. So that's really going by. I'm really dating myself by saying that. But, well, it depends on where, if you're working for somebody and they're assigning something to you, then there's a certain expectation. They send you a game, or they want you to do a feature or some kind of story, and then that gives you your guidance. But as far as if I'm just creating my own content, which I am with my blog, then I'm just casting that bait out there and seeing if somebody's interested. I did today. It's like this is me, and I'd like to talk to you about what you do. Would you be interested? And then if they say yes, and then we move forward. And if they don't, move on to the next thing. And if I don't do it, it doesn't get done, I guess, in that sense. But you just kind of, and sometimes these stories just kind of fall in your lap. I don't realize the connection. But somehow you find out a detail, and it's like, hey, that's where. And like I said before, everybody has a story. You just got to find it.
Yeah. Well, you're a self-made man, a self-made career. We could go into that, by itself. And, as we think about the numerous topics you guys have covered, Greg, let's go to you with a little different perspective. It's, you've been part of some kind of organization, I think probably most of your career. So you've had some form of team that you either answer to or they answer to you throughout your career. So tell us about that perspective and kind of your perspective as far as what gets done if Greg Rexstraw doesn't do it. But then where we're going from there is kind of looking at the industry as a whole. We've got media, we've got newspaper, that's where, and looking forward. But as far as right now, Greg's Rexstraw, when he punches the clock in the morning, what's he doing?
Talking to people on Zoom. That's kind of what I'm doing right now. It's about all we can do, given kind of the limitations that we're dealing with. But to your question or point, hey, if I don't do it, who's going to do it. That's the thing. It goes back to having those mentors and those connections, because if I don't do it, somebody else would. Now, they may do it in a different style. They may have a different method of transmission. And obviously everybody has their own set of eyes with which they kind of look through the world. But I think the same is the case in the print side of things, in the world that Steve comes from, and the same in the electronic media side of things that I come from, is that it's unique in that our resumes are the ones where you need to put your education. But what you put on top of that first is, here's my work experience. Mm-hmm. Because that will often tell me where you've been, where you went to school, who are the people that you know. And I'm old enough now to have known, okay, if this person wrote for this paper, or if this person worked for that radio station, I'm going to know who they worked for. And I can call immediately. I don't need to see references. I can put two and two together and go, hey, tell me about this, tell me about this guy. I'm looking to hire him. What am I getting with this person? And so it's unique in journalism and radio, whatever the case may be. Your work experience comes first, where you went to school, and kind of goes on the bottom of the page. Now, as far as where it is heading, and this example I'm giving is about 7 or 8 years old, but it shows you where we were even then, and it's even further heading that way now. For a brief period of time, one of my jobs was to write a 4 or 5 day a week blog, column, post content, whatever, was covering college athletics for 1070thefan.com. So again, I'm there to write for a service that exists to promote a radio station. At the same time, I would be saddled up next to the guy who was the videographer for the Indianapolis Star. A newspaper was sending someone to get video content. And that has been the way of the world now for the last decade, in that it is not, you're not a radio guy, you're not a television guy, you're not a print guy, you're a content guy. That is what you are focusing on, because we're all going into the same medium. We're all going to the internet. We're all going to your smartphone. It's just a different method sometimes of how I'm trying to relate my story or relate my information to you. You might prefer not much in the way of type. You want pictures and audio. Or I don't care about the conversation. I'm a bigger fan of the written word. And so we're already there, and it's just going to more fast forward that direction in the future.
Well, a couple great points you hit on there. Number one is the content, your content producers, and both of them really are that right now. Steve's not just newspapers. Steve's, you've got the blog, you're online, your presence on Twitter and YouTube and everything like that are growing up there. So, and the competition, as far as, finding the content and things like that, you got to do, it's everybody's producing content. Knuckleheads like HardyTheHatGuy here, producing stuff on Twitter and YouTube for free, and as we look at it across the state for fans like me, and that's all I am, it's great because content now is available anywhere. Any type of content all over the state people are opening up. I'm just thinking off the top of my head. You've got, I think it's Radio Troy on the east side of Indiana. You've got the Region Sports Network up north. And, I couldn't even start to mention all of them. It's great for fans like me, definitely makes it competitive for people in the content business like yourself. So as we kind of wrap this up, let's think of the perspective of that student in college. Some of the takeaways that I, just sitting here listening to this, took from you is the education, the connections that you just got to do, get involved from every perspective. Maybe it's, don't zoom in on one specific thing. Both of you are, multi-versed in all different sports and even outside of sports. So how would you summarize one maybe takeaway as we kind of wrap things up? What are you telling a college student that wants to get into the media, be it written, be it multimedia? Maybe Steve, let's start with you. From your perspective of coming up through newspaper and seeing things transgress into where it is today, you've seen the whole vantage point. From that perspective, what are you telling a college kid right now that wants to get into media?
I think you have to be able to diversify in however you need to, whatever platform you need to do to get that message across. I mean, I happen to be the written word is a lot of what I do, but there's the video and there's the social media and there's all those different kind of ways of getting that out there. I mean, there are some people that, I mean, I'm 56, so there's people my age and younger than me and my friends that are kind of dinosaurs, and they don't really want to embrace that. But and that's their prerogative. But you got to kind of learn how to do that. Now, you might find that you are better at one thing than another, or you prefer one thing or another. But people are consuming this stuff in little bites and stuff, and sometimes that's just a tweet or a very short, presentation might get their attention, and then you can go long form, on something else. But to be able to do it a lot of different ways, I mean, there have been different times in my career where I've done more video than others, and that's something I'd like to punch up, my skill set a little bit more. But I've done some of that. But yeah, I think diversity, you do a lot of different things, and that makes you more valuable, I guess.
It sounds like what I'm hearing is don't get comfortable in one lane. That's kind of what I'm hearing from both of you. And
That's a good way
Greg,
to put it.
yeah, and Greg, as we go back to you, like I said at the beginning there, you and I both kind of grew up in that era where multimedia just expanded overnight. We saw the birth of ESPN and then, of course, the internet, and it led to what you're doing today. What are you going to tell the kid that, from your age, back when you first was excited about it? What are you going to tell that kid for looking ahead in the future?
Yeah, go get a real job would be the first thing I tell them. But in all seriousness, go get a real job. No, it would be, if you can get a paycheck doing something, do it. And much as what Steve said, you have to have multiple skill sets. And so if you can get $25 to go write a game story for somebody on a Friday night, do it. And if you can go get 25 more bucks to sit in and do stats or be the color commentator for somebody doing high school sports on the internet or on the radio, do it. And if you can go get 45 bucks to go be the PA guy somewhere, do it. And if you can go get an internship for a minor league baseball team where you're selling tickets and you're on the grounds crew and it starts raining, you got to go to your office or your cubicle or the locker that you've got and go get your dirt clothes on, because you're also pulling the tarp, to try to prevent the rain delay to come back and play that night, do it. If you want to work in sports, then the best training you can have is to work in sports. But also know this, that you do this because you have such a passion for it, but know there are things that are going to come at a cost for you. And Steve will nod his head in agreement with this. When do sports usually happen? Nights and weekends. So this is, your work friends are going to be your friends, because those are usually the social hours. And so that's where you're going to be working. So it's wonderful to have such a passion for what you do, but know there are some sacrifices that come along with that. But my number one piece of advice for everybody looking to get into what Steve does for a living, or what I do for a living, or just sports in general, work in sports. Because once you get your foot in the door, if you do a good job, word tends to get around, and it makes it much easier to find a job on a full-time or a part-time basis.
And I'll tell you that what both of you said kind of wraps up. I've done some interviews with some other people on the topic of careers in baseball, careers in sports, outside of coaching, outside of playing. And what I'm hearing from both of you, you didn't use the exact word, but I'll tell the fans who are watching this, the reason I wanted these two guys on here is, like Greg said, doing the work. Pay your dues, stay the course. But the reason these guys are at the top of the game for what they do individually, respectfully, is because of their passion. They're passionate about, the story and the people that they interact with. I mean, it's real. You can't, when I'm watching you guys, when I'm reading your content, I know it's not, I'm doing this to get a paycheck. You're passionate about it, and you portray that with real, sincere interactions with the people that you deal with, that, comes to the content that I get to see and that I get to read. So we're wrapping things up here with this episode of careers in baseball outside of coaching and playing. And I tell you guys, both of you, I've been fans of you for a long time. You're probably sick of me spam emailing you guys for content ideas that, Greg talked about. We both talked about finding those connections. I've been bothering these two guys for a long time trying to get this done because I'm just a fan. But I'm a fan of what you guys do, and the torch is going to get passed eventually. You guys are long from being done. Thankfully, for people like me that are fans, we're going to get to be entertained by what you guys do for years to come. So the young person watching this show, these guys right here, follow what they do. IndianaRBI.com. Greg is anything sports Indiana dot anything. They're all over the place, which that kind of summarizes what they're talking about as far as getting into careers in this industry, which is you got to diversify. You got to do the work, find the connections. And I think, guys, does that summarize, how you got to where you're at today?
We've talked baseball. We've talked soccer with the scarves behind me. I will use a golf quote. It's one of my favorites. Ben Hogan asked about how great his swing was. He said the secret was in the dirt, as in he kept swinging at the dirt to go find it. Keep putting in the work, and eventually benefits you'll reap from them.
And Steve, I'd talked to you about this in another interview we did, and one of the recurring themes was have a passion, follow it, do the work. I think I think that summarizes your career as well, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there are days it's like, what are you doing this for? Like anybody says, but in the long run, you wouldn't be doing it if you didn't like it. So absolutely.
Well, guys, I sure do appreciate it. If you're watching this, be sure to stay tuned. We're going to have videos on all kinds of professions linked to baseball, and I hope you follow us for the rest of them. Guys, thanks again. I look forward to following you like I do all the time. Take care.